Imagine you're wearing just a thin shirt and open sandals, walking through the snow in Germany. It's freezing cold, and you still have to carry 30 kilograms of gear on your back. That's exactly what Roman soldiers had to do when they were conquering the northern parts of Europe. When Rome decided to take over Britain, Germany, and France, its soldiers had to face something they never expected: a deadly, brutal winter. And today, you're going to find out the secrets that kept Roman soldiers alive through some of the coldest winters ever recorded. First, let's remember something important. Rome was built in a warm, sunny part of the world. Romans were used to light clothes, fresh air, and sunshine every day. For a long time, Romans even thought wearing pants was embarrassing. But when their soldiers arrived in northern Europe and felt that freezing cold wind for the very first time, they quickly changed their minds and thought, okay, you know what? These Celtic people actually know what they're doing. And that's where everything started to change. In the winter, a Roman soldier would put on 2 or 3 wool shirts, one on top of the other. Each layer trapped warm air close to the body, kind of like a natural blanket. Then came the pants, the very thing Romans used to make fun of. They were made of thick wool and went down to the knee or all the way to the ankle. They were totally a Celtic and Gaulish idea. Roman soldiers started wearing them in secret at first, but pretty soon they became official army gear for soldiers in the north. But the clothing story doesn't stop there. Romans had 2 types of cloaks that were super important. The first one was called the sagum, a wool cape so thick you could actually use it as a blanket when you slept. It was clipped onto the shoulder with a pin called a fibula. The second type was called the paenula, which was a hooded cloak made of thick felted wool or leather. They rubbed animal fat into the leather to make it waterproof. It was basically a raincoat from the 1st century. And here's a cool detail most people don't know about: the focale. It was a wool scarf that soldiers wrapped around their necks. It did 2 things. It stopped the cold metal armor from scratching and freezing the neck, and it also kept the throat nice and warm. Now here comes one of the coolest parts of this whole story, and we know about it thanks to some really old letters found at a place called Vindolanda, near Hadrian's Wall in England. These letters, known as the Vindolanda tablets, are basically messages between Roman soldiers and their families back home. And guess what they were asking for? Not new swords, not better armor. They asked for socks. Seriously, Roman soldiers were writing home begging their moms and dads to send them more wool socks. And honestly, that makes total sense. When it's super cold, your feet and hands are the first things to suffer. And this brings up another big problem: the famous caligae, those iconic open sandals you see Roman soldiers wearing in every movie. They were absolutely terrible for winter. Think about it. Open sandals in the snow? That's basically asking to lose your toes, for real. So the Romans came up with 2 solutions. First, they made closed shoes just for winter, called carbatinae. Second, when they did have to wear their regular sandals, they stuffed them with wool or animal fur and wore them over really thick socks. It was like a genius hack from ancient times, and it actually worked. Now we also need to talk about a military trick the Romans were really good at, just not fighting in winter at all. Romans were smart. They knew that trying to fight a war in the snow was a logistical nightmare. So they had a whole system called hiberna, which basically means winter quarters. When winter rolled around, the legions stopped going on military campaigns and hunkered down. The goal was to survive, not to conquer. When autumn came, which marked the official end of fighting season, troops who had spent the summer living in tents out in the field started getting ready to move into their winter quarters. This is a really important detail. They weren't sleeping in tents anymore. They moved into actual buildings, solid structures with thick walls that were built specifically to keep the cold out. In places like Gaul and Germany, the rough winters forced the Romans to build differently. Instead of tents, they used wooden barracks or structures made of wood covered in mud with leafy roofs, local building styles that the Romans just copied without making a big deal about it. When they arrived somewhere cold and new, they didn't ignore how the locals built their homes. They copied those ideas, and it worked really well. Every group of 8 soldiers, called a contubernium, shared a small set of rooms inside the barracks building. One room was used for sleeping and hanging out, and it may have had beds, though we don't have solid proof of that. The other room was about the same size and was probably used to store all their gear. There's some evidence that these buildings had windows with glass, but the inside was still probably pretty dark most of the time. Just imagine, you and 7 other guys crammed into a tiny space for the whole winter. You'd be spending the next 4 or 5 months with those exact same people in a super small room, breathing the same stuffy air, listening to the same snoring, and dealing with each other's bad moods every single day. It sounds like one of the hardest patience tests ever. But somehow, the system worked. Now that we know where they slept and what they wore, let's look at what a Roman soldier's day actually looked like during the winter. Roman soldiers didn't get to sleep in just because it was cold outside. Discipline didn't take a winter break. It just changed shape a little, but it never got easier. The day started early, usually at sunrise, which in the European winter came really late and ended really early. The day kicked off with trumpets blasting through the camp, signaling guard changes and the start of the day's work. Nobody got a free pass. Everyone had a job to do. The first duty of the day was standing guard. Roman camps always had soldiers watching the perimeter, and in winter this was one of the most miserable things you could be assigned to do. Not because it was a punishment exactly, but because standing completely still in the freezing cold for hours, wearing metal armor that sucked all the warmth right out of your body, was just genuinely awful. And if you messed up your guard shift, or worse, fell asleep on the job, that was one of the most serious crimes a soldier could commit. The punishment was getting beaten up by your own bunkmates. The guard system never stopped for winter either, because Rome's enemies knew perfectly well that winter was when soldiers got careless. That's exactly the kind of trap a smart commander made sure to avoid. After morning guard duty, it was time for training. And here's something most people don't realize. Winter wasn't a vacation. It was actually the perfect time to fix things, practice skills, and get ready for the next fighting season. The fact that there wasn't much actual fighting going on gave soldiers time to heal up from injuries, practice their drills, fix all their gear, pack everything up, and get ready to march back when the time came. Physical training never stopped. Running, weapons practice, formation drills, all of it kept going, even in the bitter cold. And then came the most important moment of any person's day, in any time in history: mealtime. What Roman soldiers ate in winter was mostly bread and grain. Each soldier got about 830 grams of grain per day, and it came as whole, unprocessed grain, because whole grain stayed fresh longer than flour. That meant the soldiers had to grind it themselves using small, portable stones, mix it with water and salt, and cook it over a fire. The main grain they got was wheat. Barley, on the other hand, was seen by Romans as food for animals, and it was actually handed out as punishment for soldiers who broke minor rules. Getting barley instead of wheat was like being publicly shamed in front of everyone. So when we talk about what a soldier ate every day, we're really talking about wheat. Barley only showed up when supplies were really low or when someone needed to be punished. In the winter, inside the permanent camps, cooking became a bigger deal than it was during summer marches. Large bread ovens were set up all around the army forts. Stamps and weights marked with unit symbols found at these forts show that each unit tracked and claimed its own food from the shared storage. It was basically an organized system to make sure nobody stole anyone else's food or started arguments. And hot, fresh bread in the middle of a freezing winter wasn't just nice to have, it was a matter of staying alive. But bread alone wasn't the whole story. A Roman soldier's diet included wheat, smoked bacon, or fresh meat when they could get it, usually pork, vegetables, beans, cheese, vinegar, olive oil, and wine. In winter, fresh food was hard to come by, so they ate a lot more of the preserved stuff. Lard, basically cured pig fat, was a really big deal for soldiers. Even Emperor Hadrian, when he was out on campaigns with his troops, chose to eat the exact same food as his regular soldiers: bacon fat, cheese, and vinegar. He did this on purpose, to show his soldiers that he was just like them, not some fancy general who was too good to eat army food.
Now, what about drinks? This is actually one of the most interesting stories in all of military history. Roman soldiers drank something called posca, which was just vinegar mixed with water, sometimes with a few herbs thrown in. It was a popular drink among soldiers and poor city people, and it had a sour but refreshing taste. The wine and vinegar were mixed with water, which wasn't always clean, partly to cover up any bad smell or flavor. Making Posca was also practical from a money-saving point of view, because when wine wasn't stored properly and turned into vinegar, they didn't have to throw it away. Today, we'd probably make a face at the idea of drinking watered-down vinegar, but back then, it was useful, easy to make, and soldiers actually said it felt comforting in its own weird way. In winter, in the northern provinces like Germany and France, there was one more big adjustment soldiers had to make. Soldiers stationed in those areas drank beer, the very same drink they looked down on as a barbarian thing, but they drank it anyway when wine wasn't available. Rome was practical like that. If the usual drink wasn't around, you drank whatever you could get. As the cold day went on, there were more tasks to get through. Taking care of equipment was a never-ending job. Roman metal armor came in several styles, the most common being the chainmail shirt called lorica hamata and the scale armor called lorica squamata. There was also a third type made of overlapping iron plates, which modern historians call lorica segmentata. But here's the thing, that name wasn't used by Romans at all. It was made up by researchers in the 20th century. What the soldiers themselves called it is still something historians argue about today. No matter what type of armor a soldier wore, it all needed constant attention, especially in damp winter weather, because iron rusts when it gets wet. The chainmail was probably the most commonly used armor throughout Roman history, worn across almost every era, while the plate armor was only used in certain time periods and situations. Every soldier was personally responsible for keeping his armor in good shape, and if a centurion caught you neglecting it, you'd get punished right then and there. Soldiers also took part in building projects during the winter. Romans built things in the off-season. They added to walls, dug deeper ditches, repaired buildings that had been damaged by snow or heavy use, and put up new storage buildings, new toilets, and new bathhouses. As the empire kept growing and more troops were stationed in conquered areas, those temporary winter camps slowly became permanent bases. Over time, buildings made of wood and dirt were replaced with ones made of brick and stone. A Roman soldier was a soldier, yes, but also an engineer, a bricklayer, and a carpenter all at once. This was one of the big reasons the Roman army was so powerful. They didn't need to hire outside workers to build their camps and forts. They did it all themselves. And then there were the baths. The famous Roman bathhouses weren't just something rich people enjoyed in the city. Heated baths inside army camps actually became something soldiers really needed to get through the winter. When nighttime finally came, the camp gates were locked, the night guards took their spots, and the men headed back to their small shared rooms. This was when the soldiers' real social life happened. Dice games were super popular. Even though they were technically against the rules, most centurions looked the other way. Letters from home were read over and over again. Letters from moms who'd sent wool socks and updates about how the harvest was going. Bets were made, old war stories were told, and definitely exaggerated. The more religious soldiers said their prayers before bed. Then, the night was over, and all 8 men in the contubernium got settled in to sleep. And the next morning, it all started again, the exact same way. The trumpet blew, soldiers got ready for guard duty, until finally spring arrived and the campaign started all over again.